Imagine that you're on a wooden raft with 14 other people floating more than 1,000 miles for an entire summer. The year was 1974, and I was one of 15 aboard that raft, about the size of a dorm double in JA. Imagine that we were the first ones to ever raft this river. We had no iPhones, no GPS, no Google Maps. We simply had a compass, a rifle, and a huge spirit of adventure. Good afternoon. Each of us has had transitional experiences that have molded or formed our character. Maybe someone influenced you, or a new idea came to mind, or a passage from a book sparked action to develop character. For me, an experience of adventure was integral in my life, one that's underscored who I am as a person. An adventure of building a raft and floating north on the Mackenzie River through northwestern Canada to the Arctic Ocean. Before embarking on the trip, I paid a visit to a friend's house where I met her 100-year-old Portuguese grandmother, all dressed in black, even though her husband had died a generation before. She listened dumbfounded as I described the details of my upcoming trip. It went against all her understanding of the comfort and security that she had sought in life. When she asked me why I was going on this trip, I gave her a very flippant 17-year-old's answer. Because I can, because it's there. Today's title is The Past is Prologue. In The Tempest, the bard used it to mean that everything before now is just an introduction, a preamble to the next phase of life's story. But typical of so many of those Shakespearean coined phrases, it means just the opposite today. The past is indicative of how the present is defined now, and therefore sets the stage for the future. I'm going to tell you a story about doing something different, breaking out of the mold, not following convention. I realize that I've come full circle in life and that my past was prologue. We were a group of mostly high school kids from the Boston area and 2 college underclassmen, 4 girls and 11 guys. We met as a group when we cycled across Massachusetts in 1972 to Martha's Vineyard, at the end of which we really liked each other as a group. We wanted to have more fun together and do something challenging. In fact, our dream was to do something that had never been done before. Tall order. Very, very early on, our discussions settled on the idea of building a raft in the spirit of Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. But logically, where could we go on rivers that without dams and highly restricted with regulations? The Snake at 1,100 miles flowing into the Columbia, the Green at 750 miles flowing into the Colorado were shortly deemed untenable. We learned that the Mackenzie River is the 2nd largest river in North America, after the Mississippi, of course, and in fact, it's the 7th largest river in the world, and only it flows north, draining the upper half of our continent. And guess what? There are no dams, and most importantly, it had never been rafted its length, as far as we knew. Throughout 1972 and 1973, we developed this idea, researched the plans through handwritten letters, of course, and telephone calls and at occasional meetings. Although the college guys, EJ and Paul, had previously spearheaded that 72 cycling program, now on this rafting trip, we all set the agenda. There were so many tasks to accomplish as we drilled down into the details of actually 2 summers of planning. During that interim summer of 1973, we had a wilderness shakedown on a tiny island in a small cabin somewhere around Brownville Junction, Maine, where for a week we tested our limits and our skills and our compatibility, just like a real-life survivor episode of Survivor. We were unable to find any underwriters to sponsor our trip, with one exception. Well, sponsor our trip probably because this was a crazy idea, and anyway, we were just a bunch of kids. But there's one exception. Dow Chemical provided us with 4 pillows of styrofoam to be delivered to the river in June of 1974. Regarding the cost of the trip, we expected it to be about $900 per person, all-inclusive. That's over $5,000 today. That's not chump change. For me, it meant an entire high school career of working after school, no sports activities, so that I could earn my own way for this trip. This trip became the focus for the summer before my senior year. So we got ourselves and our mountain of duffel from Boston through Montreal and across Canada on this epic 4-day train journey. From Edmonton, Alberta, we flew deep into the Northwest Territories to Fort Simpson. The Mackenzie River flows out of Great Slave Lake at Yellowknife, but the first 100 miles are full of rapids, which we could not risk as an inexperienced rafting crew. Fort Simpson is the first of only 7 settlements along the length of the river, and at times we were 400 miles between settlements alone on the river. At Simpson, we camped for 8 days while we built our raft, except for the styrofoam floats, which were the underpinnings of our raft. All materials were purchased locally. We built the raft in 2 sections, bolted together to take the stress and the strain of waves. The rear half, being so light, was dragged down by the heavy forward half. We dubbed our homemade, self-designed raft the Gully Whopper, after one of Davy Crockett's keelboats. It was 16 by 20 feet. Imagine how that limited the movement of 15 people aboard. Setting sail was a dream come true. Using birch poles to push ourselves off from the narrow shore, the raft entered the flow of the river. And we counted the miles on the navigation charts with rotating captain, co-captain, and navigator on 4-hour shifts throughout the summer. The crew settled in for a summer of ever-changing scenery. You know, at first we tried to keep the bow pointing downstream. That's the way boats are supposed to go. But without a keel and with a rudder more like a paddle, the raft just swirled in the wind, in the flow, in the current. The Gully Whopper was an entity of its own. It sat low and deep in the dark, muddy water and literally went in circles for 2 months across the Arctic Circle and 300 miles more to the delta at the Arctic Ocean. Life on board the raft was, well, interesting. We had a sleeping deck on which 8 or 10 of us could sack out in sleeping bags away from the activity below. It's only short of amazing that we could sleep so much in that northern latitude where the sun really never went down below the horizon. And when it did sink, like in August, there was enough twilight to carry on. Our bodies knew no time of day and night that summer. We ate and slept at all hours. We had all brought books to form a ship's library, and these were read and discussed. There were philosophical discussions and guitar playing accompanied by my harmonica. There were discreet ways of finding privacy, like sitting on the bowsprit seat as far away as one could get from everybody else. But being so tight on board, there were tensions and tempers, abated by pullovers to shore where we could explore or exercise or set up tents to sleep some more, or simply sit on a rock alone, writing in our journals. A fresh source of water was always a reason to pull over because the Mackenzie is muddy and unfit to drink. And we needed to fill our water jugs, but a fresh stream also provided us with an opportunity to bathe and to launder. You may be wondering what it's like to be in the wilderness. I said that at one point we were 400 miles between settlements alone on the water. Imagine the distance between Boston and Washington, D.C. for 2 weeks without seeing any man-made civilization. There's a feeling, have any of you been at sea with no trees or no land in sight? There's a feeling of smallness in a universe that's huge. After passing through mountain ranges and before the expanse of tundra of the north, the river cuts through something called the ramparts, 1,000-foot cliffs that in ancient times had formed the bottom of an inland sea and risen up and through which the river cut. In any event, we didn't see much wildlife. An occasional caribou or moose was spotted on shore. And at many stops, there was evidence of fresh tracks of bears and wolves. The fact is, I think 15 rowdy teenagers made a lot of noise, and the wildlife took off. I didn't mention something important. The Canadian government put 3 restrictions on our big idea: to have a 2-way radio for regular communication with the outside world, to carry a firearm. Imagine doing that post 9/11. To carry a firearm in the event of dangerous wildlife. And thirdly, to check in with the Royal Mounted Canadian Police, called the Mounties, at every settlement. Well, the 2-way radio went overboard early on. The gun was an antique rifle found in a pawn shop in Boston, and the ammunition was wet. And we never encountered or saw the Mounties. All of our safeties fell through. But the kind river folk made up for it. Word-of-mouth news traveled downriver, and the tugboat captains and float plane operators watched our backs and our progress. The Mackenzie is mighty. Rains from across the continent cause an almost tide-like phenomenon, and the water can rise and fall very rapidly, overnight, in fact, as we found out. The Mackenzie is more than a mile wide at points and shallow. At other points, it roars through narrow passages like the ramparts, and the water in these narrows are deep and fast. More than 300 miles above the Arctic Circle, the river starts to slow down, and it forms that classic D delta. The river breaks into hundreds of channels as the water seeks the ocean. It was a huge challenge to find and to stay in the East Channel, which was our passage to Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk. As it turns out, we docked in Inuvik because the weather changed, cold. The summer was fading, and quite honestly, we were ready to be done. And thirdly, forward momentum, forward progress was negligible, and we were running out of time. So we hopped in a plane to the Inuit whaling village of Tuktoyaktuk to be able to stand on the shores of the Arctic Ocean. I want to tell you about some of the ordeals and tribulations that we faced on our journey. There were some major events that we dubbed the 7 plagues of the Mackenzie. Maybe not akin to the 7 biblical plagues, okay, but nonetheless, there were some events through which we weren't sure we'd live to tell about. The breaking apart of the raft and the resulting loss of precious goods and food overboard in a split second. This happened when the two sections slamming together in heavy waves, and the bolts pulled out. And as they were separating, and as the forward half was about to flip over, it was only amid the screaming and the splashing that we were able to grab each other's arms and lasso a rope and pull ourselves together and limp ashore for repairs. The loss of the two-way radio overboard meant, no communication with the outside world. So much for the peace of mind our parents had. The devastating sinking of the raft in mud like quicksand, and the near abandonment drama that only ended after 3 days when a tug pulled us out. The triple whammy events of the onset of a full-blown case of measles by a crew member in a First Nations population, the resulting mandatory 10-day quarantine that sent us packing on the river when food supplies were low, and we had no fresh food at all. That was the period that we lived on PB&Js on green, moldy bread. And thirdly, the rain and the wind that pummeled us during that period, pinning us to shores like drowned rats, our spirits were at their lowest point. And both the lack of fresh water and low food supplies, these were serious concerns. These were so-called plagues that we weren't sure we'd live. These were so-called plagues that tested our resolve. So were the greenhead flies, the size of bumblebees that drew blood and took chunks of flesh. At 17, I had responded to that old grandmother's question of why with the short answer of, because I can. How would I respond to her today, at 59, with more than 40 years of having this trip to look back on? Very differently. I would say to her, this trip is not going to change my life. It's going to add to it. It will be something that I have in my back pocket in times of self-doubt. It's a way of proving to myself that I'm capable of doing something extraordinary. The past is prologue. At 42, I drew upon this life experience and others to break out of convention. From a young age, I embraced nonconformity, as Joe mentioned he did too. Because in our family, we kids were given a lot of freedom to roam, and I had an epic childhood. But then I went totally conventional. I went to Brown, I went to Harvard, entered the middle management world of business for 20 years. At 42, I cast the pager, I took off the necktie, and I put on a carpenter's apron, and now I have my own business as a contractor. Who says you can't reinvent yourself? I simply fell back on life experience, knowing that I'm adaptable. Someone famous said, dreams are, in reality, just another form of planning. In other words, dreams can define the future, if you want them to. Maybe some of you here at Con have already started your metaphorical raft journey. Or you'll find your own Arctic Circle tale to tell when you're my age. I am still growing, still opening my mind to new ideas and possibilities, and still learning about courage in the face of danger and strength in times of hardship. Your undertaking may not be in the wilderness. It could be anywhere. But the challenges you face, the adversity, will become the core of your being. And it will prove the measure of your tenacity and grit. Because in the end, the single most important thing that gives life meaning is experience. Thank you.